All right. Um, so one of the real joys of science is finding harmony and patterns in nature, and that's one of the things we do in botany as well as in the more physical sciences like chemistry and physics and whatnot. And one of the people who really combined those two worlds was Darcy Thompson, who wrote a famous book in 1917, a very pioneering book called On Growth and Form. And he kind of beautifully summarized why we do all this. But to begin our exploration of patterns in plants, I want to look at symmetries, which are the kind of the most basic patterns in how plants and animals and all living things and natural non-living things are formed. The most obvious one is the one that we're most familiar with as animals and whatnot, is bilateral symmetry. We're bilaterally symmetrical, with the two sides of our body and the outside at least being symmetrical. On the inside, we're not as symmetrical. And leaves do this mostly. Some leaves are quite asymmetrical, but most are very symmetrical. And this spans the range from, on the left, we have a very ancient plant leaf, a zamia, a cycad, and on the right, we have a palm leaf, a flowering plant, both showing basically that the two sides of the leaf being mirror images. These are compound leaves that are bilaterally symmetrical, and sometimes the ways leaves are arranged are dramatically bilaterally symmetrical, such as the famous traveler's palm, Ravenella madagascariensis. It's not a palm, but grows very well here in South Florida, and you see this around, but it's got this extremely dramatic, what's called disticus arrangements of its leaves. Leaves form alternately on opposite sides, 180 degrees from each other, and you get a mirror image on each side. And interestingly enough, you see this mirror image program even on its inflorescence. So this is close-up of a traveler's palm, and then this is the part that flowers, and these bracts are also arranged in this disticus pattern, so that each side being roughly a mirror image. And so often you see these patterns within patterns, which is another interesting mathematical pattern we'll get to in a little bit, called fractals, where you see kind of patterns at different scales, large scale and small scales being the same. And plants do this a lot. That's a lot of how they create their patterns. And this is a very interesting pandanus, another monocot like the ravenella, and like corn, and like a lot of other plants that do this. And its leaves also tend to be arranged disticusly, and then when it makes new shoots, they are arranged in that bilateral pattern too. Then back to a few of leaves and the structures within leaves. This is a fig, Ficus deltoidea, that has veins that branch in a very dramatically symmetrical pattern. We'll talk a little bit more about that fig in a little while. And this is a branch of a phyllanthus. This is a genus we have here in South Florida, but this isn't a native representation. This is one from Asia. But so the center part is the actual branch, and then we have lateral branches coming off, and these branches look like compound leaves, and but the true leaves are actually these little leaves here, and these are actually specialized fan-like branches, not unlike what the situation you get in Ravenella and other plants that have this arrangement of their leaves in two patterns. But here, once again, you see, we're seeing these patterns within patterns, the bilateral symmetry of the whole shoot, and then the bilateral symmetry of the smaller branches that make up the shoot. And ancient plants do this kind of thing a lot, having these bilateral symmetry. These are club mosses in the Lycopodiaceae family, the genus Huperzia, or now Phlegmariurus, and even more ancient, the bryophytes. This is a liverwort that has, you can see it's very dramatic branching veins, and the whole shoots that branch only at the tips. They don't branch in the way the higher flowering plants branch. And then flowers can be very dramatically bilaterally symmetrical. We're certainly one of the Most dramatic examples are orchids that we're familiar with, most of which are bilaterally symmetrical. This is the dove or Holy Spirit orchid, the national flower of Panama. And also it kind of reflects that it resembles to us a dove, partly because doves, a lot of birds, are bilaterally symmetrical too. So, and this one resembles a face. This is one that you can see at Fairchild in the conservatory from Central America. It's an Aristolochia. They call it the Darth Vader flower, Aristolochia salvadorensis. And it looks a lot like a mask with two eyes and whatnot. But then many flowers are radially symmetrical, another key type of symmetry, which is where instead of just two sides, which are mirror images that you normally wouldn't be able to distinguish from walking from one side to another, in radial symmetry, where you can walk in a circle around something and see pretty much the same thing. And this is the center of a water lily flower with the anthers here, the stamens with the anthers that produce pollen. You can see a little bit of the yellow pollen, but it's pretty much looks the same on any side because they're regularly arranged around a central axis. So that's radial symmetry. And you get sometimes something like radial symmetry, but with a little bit of bilateral symmetry, a lot of combinations in plants. This is the underside of a very special water lily leaf, Urale ferox. And then this is radial symmetry, very pure radial symmetry in a type of plant that I studied for my PhD that are very kind of famous for that. It's an ancient horsetail related to ferns, the giant horsetail Equisetum giganteum. We have a few of these that, or at least one species that lives in the panhandle of Florida natively. But they have very precise radial arrangement of their branches around the central stem. So as you walked around the stem of a horsetail, you'd see the same view pretty much. And some conifers are very dramatic in this way. We just got through with Christmas and seeing different Christmas trees. They are very radially symmetrical, and these ancient conifers, araucarias in South America, are famous for being very radially symmetrical. So they look the same on every side, very precise growth patterns. But flowering plants sometimes do this too, with their leaves being very nicely arranged in a spiral. And the most famous of those that we see all the time, including in our natives, are the palms. Palms are among the most dramatically radially symmetrical flowering plants in terms of how they arrange their leaves and their stems around a central axis. And whichever way you look at a palm, it tends to look pretty much the same as you walk around it. And sometimes the palm leaves have pretty dramatic near radial symmetry. There's a little bit of it stops kind of at the bottom, but so you can have combinations of radial and bilateral symmetry. And this is a palm planting at Fairchild that's being reflected in a lake. So you have the bilateral symmetry of the reflection and the radial symmetry of the palms combined. And fern leaves can have very interesting radial symmetry. These are some ancient ferns. And then another category of interesting patterns, mathematical patterns we see in plants are spirals and helices. We'll talk a little bit about this later, but plants have some nice examples of those. But especially explore one of the most interesting and surprising aspects of mathematical patterns in plants, and that's how some famous numbers show up in plants all over the place, the Fibonacci sequence. So, and to understand that, we have to understand how plants are built, how they arrange themselves, how they're constructed, and that's called phyllotaxis, which basically means the arrangement of phyllos, which is leaf arrangement, but it also covers seeds or petals, branches, all kinds of structures. And the Fibonacci sequence, which is a fairly simple mathematical sequence that arose when an Italian mathematician was trying to model population growth of rabbits, of all things. And you just start out with the two initial numbers, 1 and 1. And you could start with anywhere in the sequence and keep going, because each number after the first two is the sum of the previous two. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, and you can go, and they get bigger and bigger, and the spaces between them get bigger and bigger, because each pair gets farther apart, because you're always adding bigger and bigger numbers to the previous one. And surprisingly enough, these numbers pop up all over the plant kingdom if you know where to look. And one of the most famous places is in sunflowers. And because sunflowers have a very complicated arrangement of seeds in the middle of the flower, which arise from all the little tiny florets, little flowers that sunflower is actually not just one flower, but it's a compound inflorescence. It's made up of many, many flowers. And that all go on to produce seeds. It's the family Asteraceae, the asters, of which we have many in Florida, including many sunflower relatives that do this, are made up. And so, but if you look at this complicated head of a sunflower with all these little seeds or little florets before they make seeds, you can find some spirals. If you look, these blue lines trace one family of spirals that spiral around, in this case, counterclockwise to the left. And the red lines you can see trace the other family of spirals. If you kind of shift the way you're looking, you see that there's also another set of spirals, and these spirals intersect. And these are called peristiches. And there's clockwise peristiches, the red, and then the counterclockwise peristiches in blue. And this is a thistle, which you can see if you look for a moment, you can see these same kind of spirals start to jump out at you. There's spirals in this direction, and then there's kind of a shallower spirals in the other direction. And another famous example that you can see in the grocery store is a pineapple, and where you can have spirals that go around in one direction, kind of shallower spirals, and then the spirals that are, if you just go through kind of a Gestalt switch, like you're looking at an optical illusion, you can see the other spirals going in the other direction. And also, this is all over in the more ancient plants, like the conifers. This is a tropical conifer, agathis, and it's also found in our native Dade County pines and their pine cones as well. And if you look carefully, you can see there's these kind of steep spirals, and then there are these shallow spirals that go around that intersect with them. And this is a male pollen cone of another Agathis species, but you can see very dramatically spirals going this way and spirals going this way. And cycads are another dramatic example in the ancient plant world. There are these spirals going in this direction, and then you see these steep spirals that are going in this direction. And leaves can do that. This is another conifer that makes it easy to see this kind of leaf arrangement. Sometimes it's not as easy to see the leaf arrangements because they're spread out on a branch, but pretty much every branch does this. But here you can see the leaves on this Araucaria going in this direction and then in this direction, because they're very small and they're very dense on this particular plant, so it's easy to see. Cacti are another great place to see these spirals. And if you look down at the top of one of these compact cacti, like a mammillaria in this case, you can see the spirals going in one direction and then the spirals going in the other direction. Another example, so these are going here and then going in this direction. And then this is a ginger at Fairchild that you can see spirals going in this direction. These are ginger inflorescences, and then in the other direction. Agaves are another great way to see this. You can see the spirals going here, and then they go this direction also. Aloes, this is the famous spiral aloe of South Africa, Aloe polyphylla. And the spirals are really dramatic in this case. You can see 5 spirals going in this direction. You can count them very easily, and then it's spirals in the other direction are a little harder to see on these, but they're all there. And it's interesting enough, you can get the spirals If you look carefully, the spirals on one of these is going in one direction, and on the other is they're going on the other direction. So depending on where the spirals, how little events that begin early in the plant's life, you may get, it's kind of like getting the vortexes that are different in each hemisphere. And see, here's the spirals going around to the left and then going around to the right in the spiral aloe. And if you look carefully on palm trunks, you can see spirals. In fact, I just took some of these today. And so it's the leaf bases of palms. Well, if you cut them away, you can start to see how they were arranged in two different families of spirals, one going fairly vertical and one going more shallowly. And see the spirals here. You don't necessarily see these at the top of the palm when the leaves are all just radially arranged, but once the leaves depart and get extended along the stem, you can see those spirals. And here's another. You can see this especially on our date palms. It's easy to see. And another plant that really reveals its spirals dramatically is the so-called mosaic plant, Ludwigia setioides, which people sometimes grow in ponds. And so all its leaves have these petioles of different lengths so that they can all float on the surface of the water. And so you can see the spirals going in one direction and then going in the other direction and intersecting. And it turns out that if you carefully count these spirals on different plants, you can get all kinds of different numbers that turn out to be Fibonacci numbers. In sunflowers, you can get numbers like 34 and 55, 55 and 89, and 89 and 144. So, though you might think if you got numbers like, 2, 3, and 5, or even 8, that, maybe it's just a coincidence, but once you start getting numbers that are that big and that far apart, it looks like there's something going on. Pineapples, you get smaller numbers because the parts are bigger and less numerous, so like 8 and 13 and 13 and 21. Cacti tend to get a little bigger. Cauliflower, you can see this in the grocery store too, not just with pineapples, but cauliflower and broccoli as well. And the numbers of petals of flowers tend to be Fibonacci numbers in many cases. We think of lilies, monocots usually have flower parts in 3s. Whereas the dicots tend to have flower parts in 5s, for example, often, and then some other numbers that are similar to sometimes these big compound flowers like daisies and stuff, and sunflowers get very large numbers. And you can tease this out if you carefully count how many times you go around the stem to get from one leaf to another on a tree branch or another kind of plant branch. And the number of times you go around the stem and the number of leaves you pass going there are usually Fibonacci numbers. And the Fibonacci numbers you get in leaf arrangements come in different pairs depending on the type of tree. And so getting up to 5 and 13 in some of them. And palms certainly have these kind of Fibonacci spirals. Ferns even, and lycopods tend to be a little more complicated, some of these ancient plants. So the big question is, where does this pattern come from? Because it looks almost too good to be true, but it's definitely there all over the plant kingdom. And it turns out that the explanation is simpler than people used to think, but still very interesting. And so it turns out if you look down on the top of a plant and look at where new structures of a shoot on a plant is where new structures are formed, and you can then connect those structures in the sequence that they come out. These could be leaves, these could be seeds, these could be branches. And it's what you can end up with what's called the genetic spiral, which connects all of these as they're formed in sequence. So at the very top of a plant, you get these new structure of a shoot of a plant, you get these new structures formed. And then, you get this very tight spiral if you trace them one after another. But then if you erase the spiral, you can see that you end up with these other spirals that come out at you at the eye, and those are those Fibonacci spirals. In this case, 5 of them, these wide ones going in this direction. And then if you connect the spirals that appear to your eye, you get the 2 families, one going clockwise and one counterclockwise. And then it turns out that if you kind of model this more precisely, you can find out that it turns out that actually to get the kinds of these Fibonacci spirals, all you have to do is separate each new structure, whether it be a leaf or a flower or something, by a very special angle, which is called the golden angle of 137.5 degrees, which turns out to be related to a very interesting property of geometry that was very much beloved of the Greeks, called the golden angle, which is related to what's called the golden section, which is simply if you take a line segment and you divide it into 2 parts, such that the ratio of the bigger part to the smaller part is same as the ratio of the whole line to the smaller part. Or alternatively, you could say the ratio of the smallest part to the bigger part is the same as the ratio of the bigger part to the whole line. And if you create this ratio, you find out that and solve for what the golden section is, you get this 1.618. And you can make a golden rectangle, and if you put golden rectangles within rectangles within rectangles, you get a very interesting spiraling effect, which is related to the spiraling effects you see in plants. And you can then take a golden proportion of the 360 degrees of a circle, and you get 137.5 degrees. And, people got very interested in this pattern, trying to see if it appeared, as the Greeks seemed to use it in some of their architecture. But it seems like they weren't quite as precise about it as we thought, and people were thinking for a long time that Mozart used it in arranging his sonata form, but it turns out it doesn't quite apply, but it certainly applies to plants, even if it hasn't been as widespread in human art as we once thought. And so interestingly enough, that if you just have this golden angle appear in plants, you get some interesting properties that just come to you for free. That if you separate each point on this spiral of something that's producing new parts, like flowers or leaves, by this golden angle, phi, you get this pattern of 2 intersecting families of spirals called peristiches, and the numbers of spirals will be in each of those families will be adjacent Fibonacci numbers. So basically, we're down to trying to explain why that angle appears between new plant structures, because that gives us the Fibonacci numbers. So that's why that angle. Well, one way to look at this is to first get some intuition about why this angle might be so important, is to look at what other angles produce in arranging plant structures. So first, there are a couple different types of angles, of numbers in general, that we have on our number line. And we have rational numbers, meaning that they aren't the numbers that you can have a conversation with, but they're the numbers that that actually can be represented by a fraction, like 1/2, 1/4, 3/4, like such as that. And then we have irrational numbers, which you can't represent as a fraction. The most famous being pi, probably, but there are many others, such as the square root of 2. And it turns out the golden section is irrational. So if we used a rational divergence angle, we get a pattern like this, where you just get like spokes on a bicycle. And obviously, that's not a very efficient way to pack structures together. because you have these big gaps. So that doesn't seem, and it doesn't form, you see this, the genetic spiral is kind of apparent to the eye early on, but then you just get things aligning along the fractional angles here, and then they become what's the spokes kind of become apparent to the eye. But it turns out if you use some other sorts of irrational divergence angles, because the irrational one, you're never going to get back to exactly the same place, so you avoid the spokes on the wheel type of problem if you're trying to pack something efficiently. And so if you did these spirals based on pi, I did this when I was an undergraduate. I wrote a little, for a little computer science class I took, I wrote a program to simulate these patterns in plant structures. And so this is what that program generated long ago. But if you, a pattern based on pi on the left, you can see that though you know, you don't get the straight out spokes forming because you can't with an irrational divergence angle. You can get these kind of the points starting to jam together on these arms they aren't straight, but they curve and they do leave gaps. And then if you use E, Euler's constant, which is very important in calculus and mathematics, you get the spokes that are actually much less, much more curvy, and they don't tend to just all jam together along the spokes. They kind of do a little bit, and then they spread out, and you get a more even pattern of packing of all these little structures. And if you use the golden angle, you get this beautiful, very uniform pattern where they never end up just bunching together along a few arms. You get these, these intersecting families of spirals that can almost make you dizzy when you see when you bring it out to a large extent, like in this case. And so it turns out that these irrational divergence angles for packing structures are better to efficiently fill a space. And usually nature's looking for efficiencies. So we might think, well, maybe that's why it needs the golden angle. But it turns out that the reason the golden angle is so good at this is because it's the most, you can actually rank numbers in terms of their irrationality, and the golden angle is the most irrational one. So in this case, being irrational is a good thing, I guess. And so that means the golden angle means you get the most efficient packing. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but just a little bit of, just so you have an idea of what goes on here, that you can actually represent any irrational number as what's called a continued fraction, an infinite fraction. And you can prove that the infinite fraction that produces phi, the golden section, is actually the one that converges most slowly to the number, the actual irrational number, whereas any other irrational number, so this is, you can see if you collapse this continued fraction at various stages, you get these ratios of numbers that are the Fibonacci numbers. And it turns out that those Fibonacci ratios converge to the golden section more slowly than any of the continued fractions that represent any other irrational number. So you can actually show that it's really hard to approximate with a fraction. And so knowing that, one of the hypotheses that had been live until fairly recently was whether or not this pattern is actually something that's, natural selection is maybe trying to force plants to pack their structures most efficiently because it would be a waste of space to have things arranged differently. But usually plants, it's very difficult to genetically program such an incredibly precise mathematical pattern. So people couldn't really figure out how that could be done. So it just kind of remained a hypothesis, because it seems like there are some genetic differences. Different kinds of plants do have different, usually Fibonacci numbers that are characteristic of how they grow. But then It took till the 90s for a couple of physicists, actually, Duhadet and Couder in France, to actually figure out how this works. And they built a very simple physical model of how the top of a plant shoot is arranged. This is an electron micrograph of a Norway spruce here, bud. And right at the top here, this happens in any plant shoots, you have the apical meristem here, and then that's where the cells divide, and that's at the tip of a plant shoot, and then you get structures forming from the arrangement of the plant parts later, and there are various plant hormones like auxins that help to space out the new structures, and you see these beautiful spirals that are happening even when these things are very, very tiny, these little, I call them primordia. And so basically they built a model based on an old German plant morphologist's model of how plants grow. So you just have the apex of the plant shoot having an axis of symmetry, so basically a straight line running through, and the symmetry being radial, all around the shoot. And the new primordia are then formed periodically in the largest available space left by the previous ones. So as they move out from around the apex, new primordia form where the biggest space is. And they form at the edge of the apex, these little primordia forming right around the edge of this apex. And then they move radially away from it as the plant shoot grows. So a few simple rules. And they built a physical system that would use these rules. It doesn't involve any biological structures. It just, this is what they're trying to represent here, this kind of Hofmeister apex. So all they have is a dish here at the bottom that is magnetized, and they have magnets along the edge, and the magnets pull little droplets of fluid that are dropped down from the center. And these droplets of fluid are magnetic. It's a ferromagnetic fluid. And what they do is then these droplets, because they're magnetized, they repel each other after they drop onto the dish. So just like the primordia in the plant are hypothesized to repel each other with hormones and with just physical pushing. So then these droplets then drawn slowly out and interact with each other by repulsion. And it turns out that if you, just with this simple system, by adjusting factors like how fast these little droplets are formed, you can get all kinds of Fibonacci patterns created. And it turns out that seemed to have explained a lot of where these patterns form. But just basically, it's something you get for free based on how plants grow, how these structures are formed. You can just, all this complex, beautiful mathematics arising from fairly simple patterns, which is what we always want in science. We're used to seeing this happen in physics, where a few simple equations can explain a lot of things, but usually that doesn't happen in biology. So this is a rare case where physics and biology, most of the times where this happens in biology, it's because it involves physics or chemistry, in this case, both. And this also showed that you don't need Fibonacci genes in plants, which is convenient because that would be pretty difficult to figure out how those would work. And so it turns out that even though one of the hypotheses was that that maybe having these spiral leaf arrangements was a big deal for maximizing photosynthesis, so leaves don't overlap. It turns out that it may not actually, the precise way it happens may not also be that significant, although it does help a little bit. But in extreme cases where you have decussate leaves, where one leaf forms right out over another, you can get some shading of leaves by other leaves. But other ways, usually other factors are more important in how the leaves are arranged in plants and whether they can photosynthesize well. But there are still some mysteries. that remain, although this simple model of Duede and Kuder explains most plants. And there's a nice YouTube video I can show you at the end if there's time, which actually is a video of the Duede and Kuder experiment, where you can actually see the spirals form from these drops. And I can also be glad to provide you with links for that. But there's one that wasn't explained by, one situation that's not explained by this, the Duede and Kuder model, which is found in this interesting plant, Erixa japonica, which is from Japan. And this has a stranger leaf arrangement where the second leaf is 180 degrees from the first, and the third leaf is 90 degrees from the second, then the fourth is 180 degrees from the third, then the fifth is 270 degrees from the fourth. So this is clearly not classic Fibonacci phyllotaxy, and it's not, nor is it like something like the simple fan shape like in the traveler's palm. And this is the kind of interesting pattern you see where you have the leaves sort of arranged in one plane, but you see how you have kind of they alternate, but then you have two on one side, two on another, and it's kind of an interesting pattern. And but they actually found out that just a couple of years ago, just in 2019, and some Japanese botanists figured out that if you add more in the model of Duede and Kuder, if you add a little more force, inhibiting force between the new leaves, you can, to that model, you can produce this more complicated pattern. So there was a fairly simple modification of the French model to make this more complicated situation work. But there's one more that's still waiting to hear how they're going to solve it, and that's a plant that we get to see in South Florida here in cultivation a lot, which is costus, which is in the Zingiberales group, the ginger group writ large. And the costus shoots have this tight spiral staircase growth, and it's hard. Nobody's figured out yet how we can produce that from this Duede and Kuder model. So this is a costus stem, sorry, with the leaves arranged in this staircase growth. And this is another close relative in the Costaceae family at Fairchild. It's showing, you see this interesting pattern of the staircase growth, which so far eludes the best of the botanists and physicists. So they're hot on the trail, though, of doing research on this. And so the Fibonacci numbers are a fascinating pattern that's been mostly explained recently. Another major type of mathematical pattern in plants are the spirals that we see in some plants. They're not quite as widespread as the Fibonacci patterns, but still quite dramatic. And a lot of them are based on what's called the logarithmic or equiangular spiral, which was given the romantic name Spira mirabilis by some mathematicians a few hundred years ago. And it's also the spiral that can be formed by putting these golden rectangles together and then connecting them with arcs. And you get this nice nautilus shell type of spiral formed, and where you get some nice patterns. That the spiral, at any stage, this little piece of the spiral looks just like this bigger piece, and on and on and on. So each part is like a miniature of the whole. It's called self-similarity, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so you can get continuous growth without a change of shape, which we see in like these snail shells, like the nautilus and whatnot, and which is neat. And so Jacob Bernoulli, one of the famous Bernoulli brothers, Bernoulli family of mathematicians in the 17th century, had this epitaph on his grave, idem mutata resurgo, although change, I arise the same. And he had, he had this spiral there because the equiangular spiral, which he studied, had that beautiful property of it changes, it grows larger, but its shape remains unchanged. And it turns out, as I mentioned, that you can actually get this logarithmic spiral from the golden rectangle or the golden triangle based on the same ratios as the golden section. So it's all beautifully mathematically related. And it turns out that these peristiches, these spirals that we were seeing all over in the plant kingdom, are actually also logarithmic spirals or equiangular spirals. And so they are pretty widespread, though they're sometimes harder to see. And of course, in plants and in animals, the chambered nautilus is the most dramatic example in the animal kingdom. And we see them on fern fronds that are unfurling. You can see how dramatically similar they can be, and you see how it's thinner in the rachis, the stem of the fern leaf here is, or the stalk of the fern leaf, it gets thinner and thinner as you get toward the tip, and then thicker outside, so you can have this shape preserved as growth continues, just like with the logarithmic spiral. And you can sometimes have spirals within spirals because most ferns have fairly complicated leaves, so they have many times compound. So you can have this compound fern leaf has spirals within spirals within spirals, all with that logarithmic spiral. Cycads exhibit this as well, some of them. You can see these spirals on these in the genus Cycas, and some carnivorous plants like some of our native sundews. I know the Drosera filifolia, which grows in northern Florida, does this also. And this is, you see this also not just in the ferns and carnivorous plants, but in some flowering plants. This is inflorescence of a Tournifordia from Jamaica. And you can see that it's very nice and spirally with that logarithmic type spiral. And we see these kinds of spirals all over in nature as well. And then in addition to spirals, another big pattern that we see all over the plant world that helps us understand their structure is the fractal, which is related to this self-similarity I've been mentioning before. And so a fractal is basically a structure where each part mirrors the whole as you go down or up in scale. And most famously studied by this fellow named Mandelbrot. And so basically you can, on a true fractal, you can zoom in as much as you want and you will still see, the same patterns repeating. And spirals are very irregular, so you can't really describe them in the same way you describe the shapes in normal Euclidean geometry like triangles and squares and regular spirals. And so you can make a triangle from smaller triangles is one of the simpler types of fractals. So where you can see this is a triangle that's made up of a bunch of little triangles, and then within each of those triangles being made up of smaller triangles, and you can go arbitrarily up or down and keep doing that. And you can make really beautiful fractal patterns, like from one famous type of fractal, the Mandelbrot set, that can really make some quite interesting patterns. And interestingly enough, you can use these to understand a lot of biological structures, because a lot of fern fronds that are very that are kind of where each part looks like a miniature of the whole. The branching of trees and stems and roots and fungi, branching of blood vessels and bronchi in our lungs and neurons, and even going down to cellular and DNA levels. So this is a fern frond of a fairly delicate one. And if you look at the whole frond as kind of this triangle, and then you see each of these pinnae that it's made up of are like a miniature of the whole, and then each of those has another unit, this little, where the pinnules are arranged, and that is like a mirror of this part, which is a mirror of the whole. So it's not a true fractal because you can't go down infinitely, but fractals approximate a lot of these patterns we see in nature. It's another fern frond where you see these little parts of the fronds, of the several times pinnately compound fronds, being like a miniature of the whole. And if you do these on computers, you can get some very beautiful fern-like patterns with true fractals. And you can use other branching equations to make all sorts of different patterns like what we see in nature. And they've been doing these for several decades, these interesting simulated leaves. You can simulate structures of branching of whole trees as well. And we see that similar kinds of very complicated branches where the kind of gnarled branches of trees look like a miniature of the whole tree as well, with each branch being like a miniature of the bigger branch. And it turns out that you can actually measure how complex a fractal is with a mathematical measure called fractal dimension. And it turns out that you can approximate these fractal dimensions of trees, and it turns out that trees can inherit them. So some trees we know are much more intricately branched than others, and there are ways to actually precisely measure this with mathematically, and even use it to distinguish trees from each other, and distinguish selections of trees that are bred for more branching. And root systems can have very complicated fractal-like patterns, even within a species, which is kind of a little bit of a foreshadowing of our next topic, which will be a little bit about how plants vary within a species. And it seems that the fractal dimension of roots is related to how efficiently roots can take up nutrients. So there actually is our crop breeding that goes on with regard to trying to make crops have more densely branched roots. And one wonderful, my favorite vegetable of all, it's called Romanesco broccoli, although it looks a lot like cauliflower, is because it so dramatically shows both the Fibonacci spirals. You can see these dramatic spirals at different levels. This kind of combines all the things we've been talking about. So you can see the spirals on the large level and then on this level within. So you can see the self-similarity where each of these shoots within this very complicated inflorescence is like a miniature of the whole. And then each of those is made up of even smaller. So all these little tiny broccoli florets is arranged into a little cone, which is arranged in a bigger cone, which is arranged into the big cone. So you've got fractals, Fibonacci numbers, the logarithmic spirals, all in one vegetable. So I encourage you to try eating one of these so you can have the full experience. But they do show up occasionally in grocery stores, and you can get seeds of this particular fantastic broccoli. And here's so you can see more closely the amazing. Years ago, this was when I photographed in California. I saw one at a roadside stand, and then proceeded to take it to a picnic table and take a bunch of photographs of it while everybody wondered what in the world I was doing. So these are the major types of patterns, mathematical patterns in plants that we just discussed. I know that's a lot to internalize. I'll be glad to answer any questions about them shortly. But before that, I want to mention one little interesting fun thing to tie in specifically to our native plants is and just to also, while we're thinking about how plants are constructed, it turns out that plants actually just small variations in how a plant and in the genes of a plant or in its environment can make pretty dramatic changes in its form and color. And because plants tend to be constructed by fairly simple rules that generate these complex, beautiful trees and shrubs and root systems and whatnot that we see. And it's interesting how dramatic, even within a species, how much variation there can be. A good friend of mine in Singapore who introduced me to a wonderful fig species called Ficus deltoidea that's a true epiphyte. So it's not a monster fig like we're used to, even with our native figs here, which are big stranglers. This is one that would never strangle anything. But it turns out that each little area where this fig grows has a different kind of leaf shape and even vein branching pattern in different figs, different colors. And these are leaves from different from some of these different types of this one species found in different areas around Malaysia and Borneo. And we've arranged some of these at Fairchild to give people an idea of how much variation there can be in the species. They're in a different place now, but this is when we had them all sort of in one place. You can see these are all one species here, Ficus deltoidea, some with big leaves, small leaves. They have different branching habits. Some are spread more, some are more upright. And so it's amazing how much variation you can have even within a species. And see there's some of these that even have leaf indentations. These are all natural variations. They aren't selected. And they often can have very beautiful color on the undersides of the leaves, not something we usually associate with figs. Some are look like hearts with branching veins almost, with bilateral symmetry and all kinds of variation even within the plant. You can have different colors on the leaves as they develop. And sometimes within the same stem, you can get leaves that have a central vein and veins branching out to the side like we're used to with a typical leaf, and then have ones that have these branching vein patterns and paddle-shaped leaves, which is more typical of this species. So it's able to, the genes are turning on and off these patterns even sometimes within a single shoot. So you can see how this is all one plant and it's making paddle-shaped leaves and the more typical kind of lance-shaped leaves with a central vein on the same plant. And it makes all kinds of different figs from one form to another, some that are different colors and different shapes, some that are hairy, some that are smooth, some that are like little cylinders, some that have more narrow cone-like shape. And sometimes slight variations in plants can make pretty dramatic overall changes in appearance. These were two slightly different forms of a euphorbia from Africa that I saw at the university greenhouse a couple of years ago. And I noticed how much more densely branched and impressive this one was, even though they looked on close inspection, it looked very similar. It was really almost impossible to distinguish if you just took one cutting of this one and one cutting of this one. You could see a few tiny differences in how closely the spines were spaced and whatnot. But once the plant develops overall, you can see that those slight differences that are very hard to distinguish up close, if you take them away from each other, can produce quite a different plant appearance. So just like with the, as we learned with the Fibonacci number patterns, how just slight, a few simple rules of how plants develop can make some pretty dramatic patterns. And this is something that explains a lot of what we see in the plant world. And now we'll get to some of the interesting examples in some of our native plants, which I'm familiar with, and I'm sure hopefully I'll learn today about some of the ones that you're all familiar with that I haven't heard of, because we have so many interesting things going on around in South Florida. We don't have probably as many unusual variations within species in South Florida because we're fairly young geographically compared to places like Southeast Asia. Florida a few 100,000 years ago, South Florida was underwater, so we're a little younger than many places, but still our flora has been around long enough to have some interesting variations. And One of them that I've noticed is in our cocoa plum, which in some areas you find white fruits that turn red when they're reddish when they're ripe, and then in other areas they are the more, like down here you see more of the characteristic really dark, almost black fruits. And I know that some native nurseries have forms of cocoa plum that come from different areas, some that are more upright, some that are more low growing, so differences in how they branch and shoot elongation can make some better for certain landscaping applications. And our wonderful saw palmetto, Serenoa repens, has some very nice forms that grow up around in Palm Beach County, the silver form, that's highly prized in horticulture down here. Here at Fairchild, we have the silver form growing right next to our more typical South Florida, the normal green form. And you can see how different they are just with a little more wax deposits on the silver form's leaves. But otherwise, you can tell it's the same species. It's just has a little bit of a genetic difference that makes a very dramatic appearance difference. And another interesting such difference that we see, probably related originally to the different ecologies of where these came from, is our buttonwood. The silver buttonwood, it has these beautiful, dense, silvery hairs. It's so prized in horticulture, actually all over the world. They love them even as far away as Brazil and Singapore. And then our more typical, the buttonwood that we usually see around here, which doesn't have those hairs, or not enough to notice, that it looks a nice lime green, but both the same species. And just today, I was talking with my friend and colleague, Dr. Brett Jestro, about variations in our native plants, and he introduced me to something I had never heard of, was that there's another buttonwood, this Card Sound Road buttonwood, and then which is probably originated around Card Sound Road, that looks like a podocarpus with very narrow leaves, so it might have some hedge applications. I noticed that one of our nurseries here in South Florida is propagating and selling it, so that could be a neat introduction to South Florida horticulture, and hopefully we'll be looking for more and more of these interesting local variants to increase our plant palette of natives here and help diversify the natives that we're growing in our landscapes. Another interesting case among our natives of interesting variations is our native Kunti, which grows all over the state except for the far western panhandle. And I've had a chance to visit a few populations around the Big Bend of Florida, and this was one we saw there with fairly narrow leaflets that are kind of which is most of the forms have fairly narrow leaflets and fairly few leaves. And like this one here that doesn't have the leaves aren't rolled under in this one, but they're still very narrow. But then there are forms up north of Daytona, kind of in the northeast, Daytona Beach and northeast coast of Florida, that have much wider leaflets and they give a different appearance and can be nice horticultural specimens. And this was one that was found near Cape Canaveral. They used to call this the Forma umbrosa, so I'm still kind of using that name. Sometimes, at one time, they called it a different species, Zamia umbrosa, but now we've lumped them all into one species, despite all the variations. And another neat variation among our native tree that I've enjoyed over the years looking at is our gumbo limbo, which we all are think of the famous tourist tree with its red peeling bark looking like a sunburn, but not all of them look this way. And some of them look like this kind of a grayish bark that doesn't peel nearly as dramatically or peel very much at all. And these are definitely a genetic difference as far as I can tell, because you'll see these trees same age growing a few feet away from each other in the same environment, but having quite different bark. For example, these were just all growing around Old Cutler Road. I just took a look at them this week. This is one growing at Fairchild. It's really dramatically flaky bark, red, and then one just down the road a little bit with very, very smooth bark, but they're all definitely Bursaris and Maruba are native gumbo, but gumbo limbo, I think it'd be a neat project maybe for some of our native nurseries and some of our hobbyists, maybe to select some of these bark forms because they grow so well from cuttings, and then people could, if they wanted more of the silver smooth bark look or more of the peeling red bark look, or maybe all sorts of other looks that are out there that we haven't noticed yet, or maybe we have. And so that's covered a lot of territory there. So I'd like to stop there and see if there are any questions. So thank you very much.